One of the four royal personages ought, however, to have excited a very deep interest. The sight of the king recalled no recollections. The two old warriors, leaders of a legion that had shone with so little luster, represented nothing but an illustrious name and a cruel loss. The daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, on the contrary, delivered up in her tender years to all the violence of revolutionary tyranny, deprived of her parents who died on the scaffold, abandoned in the dungeon of an old tower, was now passing slowly before that same Palais de Justice, out of which her mother had gone in a cart to the scaffold. In passing that same palace she was about to inhabit, what cruel recollections, what feelings of compassion and love might naturally have been excited. And still, the marks of joy, the enthusiasm were lavished alone on the old monarch. Was it that policy got the better of the more refined feelings of humanity? Or that the women, who were the most numerous among the crowd, are expected, even when moved by the most noble feelings of the heart, to show always the smallest part to persons of their own sex? The restoration of the royal family had been prepared with much skill by M. de Saint-Laurent. It was, however, necessary to give it a legal character, and as the legislative body was not at that time sitting, they had recourse to the Senate, which closed its political existence by one of the most disgraceful acts recorded in history. In despite of all laws, the Senate removed from the throne and delivered over to foreigners their lawful sovereign, whom France had elected, and to whom they owed their existence. They had, moreover, the baseness to insult the prince they disowned. I am far from refusing to acknowledge the noble qualities, the eminent services, and even the conspicuous virtues by which many members of the Senate were recommended to public esteem. But the state will nevertheless remain forever fixed on that assembly, since no effort was tried, no resignations offered, no protest uttered by any one against that fatal sitting over which M. de Talleyrand presided. The first measure of the new government was to establish the administration and to punish or stifle the disturbances which disordered passions might occasion in the provinces at the news of the installation. But before we follow that government and its measures, it is necessary to cast a look upon the nation over which it was about to rule. France had been subjected to the forms of a republic to which had succeeded the imperial monarchy in 1814. But few influential leaders of the Republican government survived, with the exception of Carnot and Barras, who had not bowed to Napoleon. The rest had been mowed by the scythe of terror or seduced by the head of the empire. Merlin, Trialhar, Sieyès, Fouché, and many others had donned the robes of ministers and senators. The Brutuses of 1793 were now designated by the titles of Duke, Count, and even Monseigneur. In the army, I find none but Jourdan, who did not enlist among the titled generals. Kleber, Hoche, Desaix, and Moreau were, it is true, no more. But would it be too much to suppose that these illustrious warriors who fell in defending the independence of their country would have also bent under the imperial yoke? The whole nation had, on the 18th Brumaire, preceded the conversion of the army. The first consul found everywhere among the people an equal disgust for republican forms of government. He took advantage of this to establish the consulate and misused it to place the crown on his head. Vanity so powerful over the French and hatred of a yoke sprung from under their feet rendered insupportable to them an authority brutal in its forms and in offensive equality. The persecutions and violent deaths which, during more than 2 years, had spread mourning and dismay, left a deep impression on the people's minds that they were resolved, cost what it might, never to go back to them. The defeats the French armies suffered in 1799, the violent and unskillful measures of the Directory, their coups d'etat, and especially that of the 18th Fructidor, added to the general impatience and to the disrepute in which they had fallen, so that when General Bonaparte returned from Egypt, all classes of citizens opened their arms to him and begged him to save France. The 18th Brumaire took place, but the conqueror of Italy was accustomed to enforce obedience. He therefore organized the country, commanded over it as he would over an army. The wonderful success at Marengo, order reestablished in the finances, as if by enchantment, everywhere excited enthusiasm. The odious attempts of the infernal machine and of the Chouans, commanded by George and Pichegru, excited indignation against the English and the Bourbon to the highest pitch. Then it was that Napoleon, convinced that he might dare all he wished, again raised up the throne of France with a master to view, master Europe. 15 years' glory and an arbitrary government had made the French more supple, and the Bourbons never doubted but their government, which they called paternal, would be received with transports of joy, especially as it appeared a sure pledge of sincere reconciliation with the rest of Europe. But Louis XVIII, dazzled by the easy obedience of the nation to his predecessor, was far from suspecting what had been hidden under the imperial purple. He did not know what troubles, what cares, what increasing obstacles perpetually arose against the former government. He did not suspect that the passion for liberty had only been suppressed, and that the contempt the nation felt for the last kings of his race extended to him. The hatred of the old court and the nobility, indifference in regard to religion, and contempt for the clergy had acquired new energy under the imperial reign. The king did not know that the emperor had lost many adherents in all classes. Finally, since the departure of the present king in 1791, a new generation had arisen and taken its rank in the social state. They were a grave population full of energy, nursed in deep study, free from superstitious mummery, leaving college to fly to the field of battle. To them, every career of science and ambition was open, and to their success in capacity was the only obstacle. Nobody had told the king that all illusion in regard to the majesty of the throne had vanished. The emperor had, in fact, never been a monarch, or at least the people had never experienced for him the superstitious awe with which they had been wont to look upon Louis XVI and Louis XV. He was admired only as a great man. The people beheld in him the gainer of so many battles, the conqueror of so many kingdoms, the invincible, the man of fate. But still, he was always Bonaparte, a glorious name, which his enemies have not been able to tarnish, nor he himself to deface. Louis XVIII, therefore, on his return, no longer found the halo of his house. In the eyes of sensible and cool-thinking persons, he was nothing more than an old gentleman of Versailles, whom circumstances again raised to a throne. His family and himself returned, however, with the old prejudices of 25 years before. They thought that the revolution had been made by men and not by the force of things, a fatal mistake which had already ruined Louis XVI. They began, therefore, to inquire of all they saw who they were and what they had done at various periods. An old rancor against the constituents, an affected contempt for the nobles who had declared themselves in favor of the revolution, a haughty indifference towards all the members of the preceding government, a disdainful and humiliating politeness towards the leaders of the army because they had still their arms in their hands. Such were the features that marked the conduct of the court. The future sovereigns, in the midst of the intoxication of their triumph, were, however, wise enough not to misuse it, and far from treating France with the violence of a conqueror who thinks he may dare whatever he wishes, they seconded the Patriot Party in their efforts to prevent France, in her misfortune, from being deprived of the laws by which she had been governed for the last 30 years. The pledges required by a civilized age were therefore laid down in a charter granted by the king under the wretched title of Ordinance of Reformation. The forms of the administration were preserved, and the agents of the public authority provisionally maintained in their posts. Extraordinary commissions were sent in all the departments to enlighten and calm the public mind. These commissaries, chosen for the most part among the disinterested and among the enemies of the emperor, obtained but little success. Private interest, however, weariness, and necessity produced a surer effect. The people showed themselves everywhere distrustful, but I have no doubt that if government had advanced with firmness and good faith in the principles laid down by the charter, it would soon have gained, if not affection, at least confidence and oblivion of the principles with which it was surrounded. But the intoxication of a triumph so easily obtained turned the heads of the royalists. The bragging of the emigrants knew no bounds. When they saw the Bourbons seated on the throne, they imagined themselves masters of their sovereign and all France. They asked, or rather demanded, employments, favors, and money. All was lavished on them. Most of them were old officers who, at the time of their emigration, enjoyed but an inferior rank in the army. 25 years' service was reckoned for them. Senior lieutenants became colonels, and colonels, majors, or lieutenant generals. The pretensions of these old men to glory, their warlike disposition, now so out of season, cast on them a ridicule that was eagerly seized by the numerous idle young officers whom peace had brought together in the metropolis, and they became the subjects of biting pleasantry and bitter irony. Songs and caricatures were directed against these people and contributed to bring them into disrepute. An unimportant circumstance gave government an idea of the exasperation that began to spread among the people. An actress of the Théâtre Français died about that time in the Chaussée d'Antin. Her funeral was accompanied by most of the theatrical characters in the metropolis. As she had enjoyed a good deal of celebrity, the procession was soon augmented by a number of those persons who had applauded her talent. When they arrived in front of the church of Saint-Roch, they found the doors shut by order of the vicar, according to the ancient custom in which France actors were considered as excommunicated. The friends of the deceased were unable to soften the obstinacy of the old priest. The mob, full of indignation, broke open the doors of the church, lighted the wax tapers, and began to sing the prayers consecrated to the dead. At last, one of the king's chaplains came, as it was said, to fill the sacerdotal functions, and the ceremony concluded peaceably. For this unforeseen disturbance, public authority was unprepared, and if the king had followed his first impulse, which was to repel the people by his guards, a riot would in all probability have ensued, the consequences of which would have been incalculable. This state of the public mind in regard to government, this propensity towards resistance, spread rapidly from Paris to the departments. The awkward position of the imperial magistrates and other persons who had been kept in office and who were all of a sudden obliged to preach other duties, other affections, and contrary opinions cast on them a sort of obloquy, and the necessity of making the Bourbons forget their former devotion to the enemy communicated to the exercise of their authority a sort of violence that wounded and irritated everyone. The purchasers of national property, who were extremely numerous, 10 millions of persons being supposed to be interested in those sales, were soon tormented by the former proprietors who, far from accepting the offers that had been made to them through fear, rejected all manner of arrangement. They declared openly that their lands would be restored to them by the king's authority, and that they ought to resume the possession of their property by the same title by which he had recovered his crown, that the loss of the subjects and the monarch having been the same, the restitution ought to be made at the same time. Finally, that the charter, which was only a temporary convention, a plain ordinance of reformation, was to be modified on that point, even if it were not abolished altogether. The king had returned with a very small number of nobles who remained faithful to his person, but all the emigrants who had come back in 1801 at the time of the amnesty granted by the first consul hastened to invade the Tuileries. And added to the joy they felt at the return of the Bourbons, complaints on their former sufferings during their emigration. They appeared every day by swarms at the chapel of the Tuileries, most of them dressed in plain clothes, ornamented with shoulder knots, and having by their sides the swords of their deceased regiments. The accounts of their ancient prowess at Coblentz and in the Legion of Condé appeared pitiful to those who had beaten them with so much facility. They seemed as if they had returned but the day before, and their boastings, supported by the favors of the court, have given great offense to the warriors who had recently fallen with so much glory. Finally, after a space of 20 years, the whole troop of Coblentz and the banks of the Rhine insolently triumphed in 1814, as if they had succeeded 20 years sooner. The army was still a greater cause of uneasiness. Though exhausted and mutilated by the last campaign, still a feeling for glory, and the name of the emperor remained alive in the hearts of the troops. The marshals and many of the guards had yielded to necessity, but the greatest part of the officers remained faithful to these noble sentiments. Discipline and the military virtues were nevertheless preserved and shone with a new luster. The king could not review the troops himself on account of the bad state of his health, and the princes affected, every time they saw them, a degree of distrust and neglect, which seemed augmented by the jealousy they felt for their glorious deeds. The following circumstance has been related to me by Count d'Erlon. The Duke de Berry was one day reviewing some regiments garrisoned in the province of which Marshal Duke de Treviso was governor and Count d'Erlon commander. An officer came out of the ranks and asked the prince for the cross of St. Louis. "What have you done to deserve it?" "I have served 30 years in the French army." 30 years robbery," replied the prince, turning his back on him. It is true that, the marshal having remonstrated, the officer obtained the next day what he had solicited, but the words were reported about, and I leave the reader to judge of the effect they had among the troops. The court dispersed on the surface of the empire were soon deprived of a part of their officers, whom disgust and forced resignation banished from the army. The staff and that crowd of military agents now became useless, returned to their homes, whither they carried the discontent and hatred that filled their breasts. The 2 last campaigns had been ruinous to them. They had almost all lost their baggages. Exasperated by the presence of an enemy recently victorious, now masters of the country, but who had been beaten during 20 years, the necessity of submitting to the yoke of the Bourbons, whom that enemy had brought with them, soon grew unbearable. Without fortune or possessions, rejected by government, accustomed to the adventurous life of a camp, they saw nothing before them but misery and disgrace if the Bourbons remained on the throne. They wished at any price to alter their situation, and their thoughts were directed with dissatisfaction towards the island of Elba. So many causes of confusion were still not sufficient to open the eyes of the Bourbons. The 3 first months passed away in apparent tranquility. Government thought nothing was easier than to subdue the dispersed, disaffected, and the allied sovereigns who began to fear the effect which might be produced on their troops by the example of our easy manners, and especially our opinions, consented to retire after having settled their accounts. France had immense sums of money to pay. The terms and condition of payments were settled, not without a good deal of difficulty. The Allies probably carried away with them doubts on the long continuance of a government that began so ill, but they were satisfied at seeing France weakened for a long while and fallen from the high station to which glory and civilization had raised her. The charter had instituted 2 chambers. The Chamber of Peers, which was the former Senate, had lost all consideration. The honorable men it contained added no luster to it. They had, besides, all risen by the Revolution. The king introduced into it all the old peers of the monarchy, and some of these who had of late served with distinction. The newcomers gave to that body and received at the same time from it habits and a love for subservience. And if the nation took but little interest in the elevation of men who numbered in their rank the Count de Bourmont and the mayor of Bordeaux, the king might at least be assured that this assembly would for a long time still maintain the traditional obedience of the imperial senate. Things were, however, not quite the same in regard to the members of the legislative body. They had been chosen at a time when war had become for France an insufferable burthen. Several of them had energetically opposed the demands of government in 1813, but the number of royalists was not yet very considerable, and if they had consented to abandon the imperial government, it was not with the view to submit to arbitrary law under the authority of a king. Government found, therefore, if not obstacles, at least serious warnings. When the councillors of the crown submitted to the chamber projects, which but ill agreed with the principles of the fundamental law, that wounded the feelings and prejudices of the true friends of liberty. One of them, Count Ferrand, disgusted the assembly when he came in the king's name and established distinctions in the conduct of the French at the different periods of the Revolution, distributing praises to some and reproaches to others. His comparison of the straight line and the curved line applied even to those who had rallied round government, spread alarm and indignation in everyone's mind, and the emperor perfectly well appreciated how serious that imprudence was when he said, "I came with Monsieur Ferrand's speech in my hand, convinced that the whole nation would rally around me."